Hello and Yali Madat everyone. My name is Sadiya Abjani and I'll be the moderator for this webinar. So today's webinar is a joint secondary initiative between STEP and ALIF. STEP covers 7th through 10th grade students, and ALIF, American Lived Ismaili Faith, is a new holistic and interdisciplinary year-long program that enables 11th and 12th grade students to explore American Ismaili Muslim identity and provides opportunities for college preparedness, budget and planning, and integrates mental health lessons as well. So this webinar series has been conceived as an initiative across the youth serving Jamati institutions aimed at engaging the secondary students and their parents, but it's open to the entire Jamaat. The series aims to explore the foundational underpinnings of the secondary program through developing a stronger understanding of engaging secondary students within the context of our faith. Now, before we begin, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. For those of you who are unfamiliar, land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. To recognize the land as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It's important to understand the long existing history, acknowledging that the land on which I reside is the occupied, unceded, seized territories of the Pennacook communities with the Pawtucket Village and Wamasett Village people. People whose elders looked after this land for generations, which is now known as the Lowell area. These tribes have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we would like to pay our respects to elders both past and present. We believe the work we do as an Ismaili Muslim community, guided by the ethics of our faith, are part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to marginalized communities, including the Indigenous people on these lands, and working towards a society that is more just and equitable. Concepts such as these are found embedded in the secondary curriculum. Today, we'll explore the approach taken across all of the religious education curricula, which is entitled Understanding the Civilizational Approach in Religious Education. During the session, you'll also see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation, and we would love to hear from you. We'll try to address as many questions submitted during today's talks as we can. With that, let's get to what you've all been waiting for. I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. We have Anil Ali. Anil serves as the academic director for STEP at ITREB USA. He finished his undergraduate studies in Islamic Studies and Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Texas at Austin before joining the STEP program at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. He served Jamati Institutions in the IIS in various roles over the last 15 years. Thank you for joining us, Anil. We have Zahra Somani. Zahra received her undergraduate degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in English Literature and Religious Studies. She went on to graduate from the second cohort of STEP and has spent the last 12 years teaching both in the US and abroad, including in Bangladesh, Malaysia, and Singapore. Currently, Zahra serves as the curriculum lead for ALIF and is also back in school earning her master's degree in marriage and family therapy. Thank you both for joining. I am so honored to have you with us today and so excited to hear from you, genuinely. So let's get started. As we begin, I was wondering if you could help us with some foundational concepts. Specifically, what is faith? What is religion? What is spirituality? How do they intersect or differ? And what do these ideas mean to you?
Well, thanks, Sadiya, for having us. And I'm excited to be here with Anil speaking about some of these very important ideas. I think your first question about faith and religion and spirituality is a really good one, especially here in the US, because we tend to use these terms pretty frequently, sometimes interchangeably. So I would love to share my thoughts on the relationship between these three. And, you know, when I hear the idea of religion, what I think about is the rules, like the rules and the principles and the structure that makes up faith, makes up religion, right? So, you know, some of the timings or the logistics or the mechanics, the rules and the principles. And I think these are really important. And what they allow for is to engage with spirituality. So religion and the structures and the rites and the rituals and the practices are vehicles by which we can engage in spirituality or invoke our spirituality. So sometimes what I tell my students, right, when we're talking about rites and rituals, is that we need these things that engage our body because we are bodily individuals. We are here not just as souls, but we're souls within bodies. And so religion and the structure and the practice of religion helps us to engage our bodies that invokes our spirit. And I think that when you combine the two of these and you practice these two, or you kind of engage with both of these ideas of the practice of religion and the invoking of spirituality, eventually over time, with the ups and downs of life as they bring it to us, is what is born of faith. This is the result of practicing your religion and invoking your spirituality, that over time, when you engage with these two things, what comes is faith. And faith to me is almost another word for like trust, right? That over life and over time, as things happen to you, you build this faith and this trust. And then the practice of religion helps you to renew that faith. And that spirituality helps you to engage and to build that faith.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Anil, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely, Sadiya. It's a pleasure to spend the next hour or so having this discussion with you and Zahra. I'm really thrilled and look forward to our chat. Zahra, I thought that was a really beautiful way of thinking about how to make sense of these terms that often are used interchangeably. Individuals have their own meanings and how they understand it. And I think what you shared reminded me of the distinction that we see in the Quran as well between a mu'min and a Muslim, and Surah Al-Hujurat often is referenced as a way to kind of think about how when the Bedouins would come to the Prophet and tell them that we have faith, and the surah makes a distinction to tell the Prophet to say that you have only submitted and accepted the religion, but faith has not yet entered your heart. So I thought that was a really beautiful way of kind of thinking about it. I think for me, if I may add a thought, I think faith for me is, an aspect of human culture. We think about faith and we use the word faith in our day-to-day language. I have faith in you to do X, Y, and Z, or I have faith that something will happen as I hope and expect. But in religious traditions, faith has a much more powerful, much more significant meaning, right? And it has to do with making sense of our place in the cosmos. And all of us, I'm sure the three of us and our listeners, at some point in our lives, think about the questions of who I am and where do I come from, and what is my role here, and what should I be doing, how should I be behaving, and what happens when I die, to me. And I think those questions, I feel, are very much tied to this idea of faith, because your faith becomes your compass in how you think about them, the way you make meaning of it. And for me, I think that's what allows you to kind of give meaning in a way. It's the kernel that inspires and give meaning to a religious tradition that you may be a part of. I think faith is what separates, regular water from a special type of water, so to speak, or a gesture of bowing as a sign of respect. When you believe in the divine as part of your faith, if you do, it has a different meaning than bowing to somebody else, And so for me, I think faith is kind of the kernel. Religion puts the framework within which that faith, gets traction and becomes real for you. Spirituality is an interesting term for me, because there are many who will say I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And others might argue that, well, you can't be spiritual unless you're religious. And I think it's an interesting dialogue to have, because I think there is a diversity of meaning and interpretation and personal way of kind of thinking about it. I think for me, spirituality is about never-ending search that you have in life. And to what Zahra said, I think in many ways it is part of a religious tradition that gives meaning to that spirituality. And in other ways, I think I personally, and this is my own view, I'm comfortable with people saying that they feel spiritual, but maybe not, subscribe or feel connected to a tradition. But the question I often ask from people when I hear this idea is, how do you actualize that spirituality, right? Without a grounding framework, without a way of thinking about it, what does that even mean for you, right? How do you translate into action? How do you translate into beliefs and values? And often, if it's not a religious tradition, I feel like that spirituality is rooted somewhere. It can't exist in a vacuum on its own. So I think those are some interesting thoughts that I thought might be worth sharing as one way of how I make sense of some of these ideas. Of course, within faith traditions, these have particular meanings and how people make sense of them. And for us as Muslims, obviously, faith is very much tied to belief in one God and the Prophet, and that's what sets the framework for how we think about our faith and religious tradition. So.
Wonderful. Thank you both for articulating those things so well. I'd like for our listeners to keep in mind these definitions or frameworks, as Anil put it, of faith and spirituality and religion as we dive into the RE curriculum. So within the RE curriculum, we often hear about the civilizational approach. Could you share a little bit more about what the civilizational approach is?
Yeah, I can take a stab perhaps, and Zahra,
please
if you add to this. Civilizational approach for me is kind of the bedrock of religious education and how we think about RE within not just secondary or primary or within the US. It's really how the entire pre-K to 12th grade and beyond, right? Religious education thinking is designed around. And to put it simply, a civilizational approach to religious education is an approach that tries and attempts to understand faith from an intellectual perspective through using lens of humanities in a way where an individual who engages with faith formation, with religious education, does so with critical thinking skills at the forefront and tries to make meaning of one's faith in a way that is grounded and situated within a particular context, within a particular time, within a particular space in how we interact with each other. And this entire approach, this civilizational approach, humanities approach, comes, from very clear guidance from Nazir Imam, where, he encourages us as a community, but also others to kind of think about Islam, not simply as doctrines and theologies and rituals and practices, but to see Islam as a world civilization. In fact, seeing different Muslim communities as civilizations within the faith of Islam that interact and engage with each other, but also with other societies across space and time. And I think thinking about it from that perspective allows for a different type of dialogue and interaction and sharing that if you just simply take a theological doctrinal approach, would take away from the richness that exists within our faith. And to give you some examples, when we think about, a particular society or civilization, I'll use Fatimids as an example. I think knowing about their context, their economical landscape, the culture of the time, the environment, the weather, even, right, the language, the food, expressions of culture through music and writing and art and architecture, how they were organized politically, I think allows for us to understand the faith as it was lived by people in that time and in that society in a much more rich and nuanced way than to simply take a very kind of theological approach and say, well, what did people in the Fatimid times believe about A, B, and C? I think it takes away from that holistic approach to kind of thinking about faith. So in that sense, I would say culture and civilizations are not only reflections of faith, but they're also expressions of faith for believers and for communities. And in taking a civilizational approach to religious education, I think we allow for our students to really make sense and meaning of why people did certain things, why did certain beliefs come about, why did certain doctrines develop in different spaces and time, and how do I make sense of them, and how do I make meaning of them, and how do I apply them in my life today, rather than simply saying, this is what it is, and I just need to understand and memorize it. So I think hopefully this gives a little bit of a sense for how I make sense of civilizational approach and the value that it holds for us. Zahra, I don't know if you want to add anything to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you described about the richness of learning about our about Islam beyond just, you know, the rules and the rights and the regulations, there's a whole different appreciation and a beauty to it. And you know what I find interesting about this question, you know, is that the civilizational approach, I think we're using the term now, but it's been around for a really long time. It's in the Talim curriculum, and it starts there. And what's really wonderful, some of you may have heard of this term of spiral curriculum, but what we teach in Talim curriculum, whether it's about, you know, Prophet and Gadirkum and the trash lady story, right? Everybody loves the garbage story of the woman throwing trash. This is a part of the literature, and the stories are a part of the civilizational approach, right? And understanding the landscape at that time. Even I think about my mom, who loves to teach 5th grade, the Fatimid Bazaar, and the way that this tradition comes to life, right? When her students are, you know, having little trinkets and bracelets and the colors and the spices, like it brings a whole other understanding of Islam, right? And I sometimes ask my students, like, what would Islam look like if the Prophet lived in China? So these contextual ideas and geographies make such a big difference, right? And while our students learn about, you know, the Fatimid Bazaar in 5th grade or Gadirakum, you know, earlier on, when they get to the STEP curriculum, they revisit that, but again, in the civilizational approach, and they take it deeper. So now we're not reenacting bazaars, but we're talking about some of the conversations in the majalises that were had at the courts at that time, right? And then when you come to the ALIF curriculum, we revisit that, maybe not in the Fatimid context this time, but using that same principles that were discussed in the majalises, we now look at how that fits into the social justice context of today. And what's really great about the civilizational approach is that when you look at civilizations, you can look at civilizations over time and throughout places and make connections between that. And so when I can look at the civilization of Islam at different time periods, I can then understand, when I look at my own civilization, how it aligns and fits in with the past, and how I bring that past into the future. So for me, I think that this civilizational approach, like Anil said, becomes a very rich way of understanding history and our faith and Islam and the people that have practiced Islam and evolved Islam throughout time and space.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate the thorough definition that you both provided. And I don't think I've ever seen how it comes, like how it shows up in Talim and kind of spirals out. That's actually really beautiful to see from this big picture view. So thank you for that. You know, earlier we talked about faith and spirituality and religion. And I'm wondering if you can help me understand, you spoke to this a little bit, but why do we take a civilizational approach in our classrooms? Why don't we cover more theological concepts, things like rites and rituals, devotional literature, specific prayers? Why are we taking this particular approach?
Zahra, would you like to start us off, or?
Sure. So I think that, you know, one of the things that is important to understand is that when we talk about religion, right, it's all encompassing, right? So civilization, culture, religion, they all kind of fit together, and you can't really talk about one without the other. So when we're looking at why is there an absence of rites and rituals and theologies, I would argue that there isn't actually, and that if you look at the curriculum, which takes an interdisciplinary approach, which means interdisciplinary means it uses different disciplines to teach ideas, right? So different disciplines meaning we look at social sciences, we look at literature, we look at architecture, we look at art, and we look at geography, we look at history, and all of these different things come together to teach a particular concept. So when we're looking at theology, for example, this idea of learning about God in Islamic civilizations and cultures, that comes from looking at devotional texts, not just Qinan, but also looking at poetry that came from different civilizations. We look at different nats, qasidas, and that's just one aspect of it, right? We also look at the way in which architecture is a reflection of theology. So if you look at the way, for example, that some of the cities are set up, that too is a reflection of theology. So you've got, the Fatimid and the Fatimid cities are set up in concentric circles. And on the outsides, you have the Muslims. In the inner circle, you have the Momins, and in the center is the Imam. That's the architecture, that's the setup and the geography of the city. So how can we say that we're not talking about theology when we're talking about it very specifically? We're just using a different lens to talk about it. And to me, I think that's so incredibly powerful that we can take theology out of a scripture or a text and say, look, it is reflected literally all around us in the things that we are reading and seeing and understanding. And that's the beauty of this, is that, and I think like another nuance or another like level of understanding that Islam is a way of life. It sure is. It's a way of your city map too. So if you forget how to get to a certain place, just think about, your theology and you'll figure it out. So I think that, there are different ways to understand and to broaden our understanding of theology and to see that actually it's reflected in so many different ways in which we understand. And as Anil said earlier, this is what the civilizational approach is. You cannot divorce one from the other, right? Your understanding of God and your understanding of Islam comes from, the places in which it's practiced and talked about and lived, and, some of the food that we consider to be central, or the spices, or, the colors even, right? Even the colors of Islam, or some of the symbols or representations that we like to say are born from a particular place, right? And so I think that these principles of theology are for sure covered, maybe just not in the traditional ways that we see it. I know, what do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Zahra. And since we have obviously a lot of people listening in and kind of thinking about our own faith tradition, and we take great pride in calling ourselves a Batini tradition, and I personally like to think that it's the civilizational approach that allows us to maintain that spirit of being a Batini tradition. And what I mean is, taking a civilizational approach allows for a particular type of meaning making, a particular type of understanding that encourages diversity and appreciation and recognition of diversity and pluralism, so that civilizational approach is also, almost in contrast to very literalist approaches to thinking about the faith and theology, right? Some of the recent publications of the IIS, kind of take one surah, a few ayahs, and there's an entire corpus of interpretations of that, selected verses across space and time. And there's beauty in that, because theology now is not simply what you must believe or you're no longer Muslim, but to actually think about, how do I make sense of it? How do I make meaning of it? And how have others in the past made meaning of this and understood this? And I think there is so much beauty in that, that if we don't take the civilizational approach, if we don't take the humanistic approach, we lose out on that creativity and creative meaning making that has existed within our faith tradition over the last 1400 years. And I think we do the same thing in our classrooms. If I can think about from primary to STEP and ALIF, we look at our past and our present within its particular context to make meaning of it, right? When you begin to think about Arabia before the time of the Prophet, you begin to understand certain practices, certain belief systems, and certain ways of organization that perhaps the Prophet adapted, changed, modified, right? But he came within that context, and as part of that context, you can see how Islam emerged and the beauty of how it gets situated within Arabia. Just to take one example, right? Like even the idea of Hajj existed before the time of the Prophet, right? And today we see Hajj as something that is very near and dear to Muslims around the globe. But taking a civilizational approach allows you to make sense of it, right? Thinking about the idea of salah and gestures that Muslims perform, and how there is so much resonance and similarity to the Jewish prayers, for example, kind of helps us make sense of how faith traditions don't exist in isolation. And that's why we try to do that within our classes, so the students understand their faith within that. I think the second piece I would say is the civilizational approach allows for content selection and prioritization in a very different way than a very literalist textual theological approach. You don't simply cover the history of the imams, or you don't simply cover the history of the Jamats. in isolation of what's happening around the world in those times and in those periods, which allows for students to ground themselves and situate themselves within the broader fabric of the Ummah, but also in humanity at large. And I think the third thing I would say is pedagogically, I think civilizational approach allows for really interesting approaches that, take away from students sitting in a classroom with books open and kind of nodding their heads back and forth memorizing. You're doing role plays, you're doing debates, you're doing case studies, and you're trying to bring about a way of learning that encourages imagination, creativity, and inspiration from the faith rather than memorization and regurgitation and forcing students to say you must have blind action, otherwise your faith is not strong enough. I think it allows for that type of creative agency for the youth to kind of make meaning from themselves. And then I think lastly, it's not simply the past and the present, right? But there is a mirroring for the future. Students live in the world of today, in the society of the US in the 21st century, but they're heading towards a future that I would say is largely unknown. And so how do we prepare our students to tackle challenges of the future, to make meaning of their faith and see themselves as people who have to take actions to be contributing members of their community and society at large? It's only through looking at civilizations of the past, drawing meaning from it, learning from mistakes that individuals may have made, learning from all of the accomplishments of people, learning from how people made sense of it and how they address challenges, drawing inspirations from the Imams and the Prophet and historical dais and other figures of inspiration, and thinking about what do I need to do today as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, or even a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, to then prepare myself for the future in which I have a very active and important role to play. And I think all of this would be absent if it's not without the civilizational approach, in my humble opinion. So those are some thoughts I wanted to kind of build on, Zahra, to what you shared as well, and perhaps share some of the examples of how this comes alive within the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're saying about, civilizations and its tie to the way in which we approach the world is so important, because when we're looking at, civilizations and history is a way to look at it's how we look at our past, right? But what you said about mirroring of the past and reflecting into the future, I think is really critical, because when we're looking into the past, what we're actually seeing, right, is theology in action. We're looking at rites and rituals in action, and not just in the prayers and not just in the way that we do Hajj or Salah, right? But when we look at the actual origin of Islam, it is in social justice, right? So when we're trying to figure out, our students come to us and they're so inspired, right? They see things in the world and they want to change and they want to be a part of this movement. And they're excited to see that, right? And what's so wonderful about taking this approach is that they're asking, how do I live my faith? How do I live, right? And we can say, you can live through your faith. How do you live through your faith? Let's look at the past and see how other figures have lived in their own context. And you see again and again, whether it's the prophet standing up and supporting the voices of the marginalized, you see it not just in him, but you see it in Prophet Abraham, you see it in Prophet Moses, you see it in Prophet Muhammad, you see it in Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, you see it in Hazrat Imam, right? Again and again, the way in which Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah fights for women's rights, the way that he was among the first in the Jamaat to take the vaccine at his time, right? To encourage other people. Like, these are ways in which they fight for what is right. And what I think is really beautiful, I heard this, so this past weekend, some of us were at a teacher educator training for ALIF, and one of the teacher educators said something so beautiful, that we need to teach our students their roots so that we can show them their routes. And I think when we show them their roots, the civilizational roots of social justice, you cannot practice social justice without understanding the social context, right? And so when we teach our students about what it means to live their faith in a civilization, in a context, when we show them the roots of Islam, not just the ways in which to pray, but in the ways in which to live and interact ethically by standing up for what is right, it becomes very clear what their route is today, which is to do the same. And they have source upon source of inspiration to guide them in that. And that's what I think is so beautiful, that there's no way that we don't cover these important principles in Islam. We just look at it in a more holistic and more richer way that shows students what they can do beyond just the four walls of their house or their prayer space, but in the world around them.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for that. What I hear from you is that the civilizational approach is actually an approach to faith and theology. And I'm wondering, how does the civilizational approach support a deeper understanding and practice of our faith, or a deeper understanding of the practice of our faith? Anil?
Sure. Yeah, I can start, and then Zahra, if you want to add to some thoughts. But I think first is by looking at our faith civilizationally or humanistically, it allows for us to, look at it from a perspective of curiosity and dialogue, and dialogue with the past and how you make meaning of it. And within that, I think, inshallah, if we do our job well, it creates a sense of pride in the legacy and the heritage that is part of our faith, which allows for all of us to kind of, represent our faith in a way that is more than simply what the media might show, and unfortunate and troubling representations of the faith of Islam. I'm sure all of us are familiar with. I think by bringing in art and architecture and culture and all of this allows for us to kind of create a different sense of belonging to the tradition that goes back 1400 years. And if I may kind of take a detour, even today, if we think about the work of Maulana Nazir Imam, all of the music initiatives, the architecture, the parks, the museums, and so on and so forth, if I dare say, these are not simply passion projects of Maulana Nazir Imam's family. These are markers of that challenge a particular narrative that exists out there about our faith, and these visually, through material culture, through architecture, through the kind of work that is being done, portray an image of Islam that is different than what many might believe and kind of have misperceptions about. And I think for me, there is a lot of beauty in kind of bringing these to our students to create a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment within that. I think that the third or fourth piece I would say is this idea of sense of connectedness with my identity to the people that exist today in other parts of the world who are my brothers and sisters in faith, but also a sense of identity that goes back, like I said, 1400 years. And how do I make sense of it living in America today in the 21st century to the kinds of things Zahra was talking about, right? The messages and morals and values and examples of figures in the past, of imams, of the Prophet, and how we make meaning of that for ourselves. I think there's a lot of beauty in that, and ultimately to kind of ensure that students don't think that the Ummah existed in a vacuum. I grew up in Pakistan, and I must tell you, there was at least 2 years, full years of RE where I literally just learned the history of the imams and memorized it from one imam to the next for all 49 imams. But I had no sense of understanding of what's happening in the world around at these particular moments when imams had to make certain decisions, when they had to flee for their lives, when they had to make tough decisions to protect the Jamaat and the community at the time, right? But taking a civilizational approach, thinking about how to make meaning of it, I think allows your faith to be a bit more richer, a bit more nuanced. You can actually articulate your faith in relation to others that you're interacting with, and finding resonance and connection and looking at shared paths and the encounters that took place to kind of learn from them and to kind of grow from them. So I think there's a lot of beauty in taking this kind of approach where faith becomes, I think, a bit more richer, a bit more grounded. I think the metaphor Zahra used about roots to routes, I thought was beautiful. And I think this allows for a different type of an understanding and belief than simply just being taught to practice, certain rituals a particular way, celebrating certain festivals, holding A, B, and C beliefs, and that be the end of it all. It would be very kind of uninspiring, I would imagine, for a youth to simply be taught to do just those things.
I couldn't agree with you more, Anil. And I think, Sadiya, if I remember correctly, your question was, how does the civilizational approach support the understanding of the practice of our faith? Right now, this is a question as somebody who works with the ALIF team and also faces teachers and parents and students and everybody. This is a question we get all the time. And the first thing I think, or the question I have back is, what do you mean practice of faith? Like I'm always so curious about what the person who's asking the question is defining as the practice of our faith. And I would venture to guess that it is rites and rituals, right? That the physical practice is how we're human beings, right? And I mentioned this in the beginning, that when we talk about religion and spirituality, we can't help but be in our bodies, right? We are material human beings. So it makes sense that we use these physical aspects to connect to these broader, concepts, right? It makes sense instinctually. But what's funny is that, Anil, everything that you said, right, about the imams, whether it is, you just said in the history that you learned, it was the dates, but also like how they solved certain problems or moved, under persecution and threat, like what they did, or that you mentioned that today our imam is, building parks and museums and investing in the arts. And I think about, even when I think about what I've learned about imams through history, because when we learn about the history of our imams, we're learning about the practice of their faith, but we're learning about the practice of their faith, right? Like what that actually meant to them in their real time, right? So what does it mean to celebrate? What does it mean to make difficult decisions? What does it mean to respond to the challenges of your context? So when I think about Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, yes, sure, somebody has told me about the 30-minute dua that's parts of our Jamaat had practiced, right? But when I think about him practicing the faith, or when I think about what he meant to us, I mean, he was, the president of the League of Nations. He was the one that was interacting with various diplomats. He's the one that was setting up the precursor to the AKDN. Like they are showing us what the practice of faith is. They are showing us, right? So when somebody asks me, what about the practice of our faith, or how does civilizational approach support the understanding of the practice of our faith? If I told you that our imam is, the Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah was the pioneers of championing women's rights, right, and education, that wouldn't make any sense to you unless you understood the civilization within which he existed. When we talk about the Prophet, right, and we love to talk about how the Prophet and Islam was a champion for women's rights, but that only means something if you understood how little rights they had to begin with. Right. So when the Prophet is practicing his faith, he's practicing, right? When you look at the Quran itself, right, the years over which the Quran is revealed, it talks about the ethics and the ethos and the behavior and the interactions, but 90% of it is thinking about God and his creation and how to interact with it. So when I think about practice of faith, yes, absolutely, it's rites and rituals. The Quran says that too, but it says that 10% of the time. The other 90% is the way in which we interact and treat each other. And that's what I think is so critical to impart to our students, right? Is that you can practice your faith. Please, I hope I see you in Jamaat Khana. Please come say Yali Mada to me. But I hope I see you out in the streets doing good also, right? Because that is what our forebears were doing. That is what they taught us. And I think that we would be missing 90% of the Quran if we didn't talk about the ways in which we engage and interact with each other in our own context. So that's my 2 cents. I get really excited about this because it matters to me.
I was just about to say that I see the joy on your face as you're talking about this, and it is radiant, and I appreciate it so much. I appreciate the passion. But you're right, this is, a question we get all the time. So I want to dig just a little deeper for an answer. Now, you said that 10% is rites and rituals, right? So let's dig into that 10%. If that's not coming up in RE, who should help build this understanding with our students? Where is it coming from? Where should it come from?
That's a great question. And I think a very fair one, right? Because I think just like our instinct when we think about practice of faith is to narrow it to rites and rituals, I think the instinct when we talk about religious education is to narrow it to the classroom. But actually, religious education extends beyond the time that we spend in the RE classroom. And it's a function of our community and our family, right? So I know that, you know, there are so many things about my faith and my understanding of faith that I've learned through, you know, my aunties and uncles in Jamati, right? My family. And I think that there are a myriad of touch points that we provide, or that, you know, that we can talk about, that I think Anil can also speak to later. But I also think that there's something in this question that needs to be addressed, right? Because it's our job to also hear what people are saying, and then to see and hear the gaps of what people are not saying. So I want us to think about this logistically, right? Like, if we were to cover rites and rituals, doctrine and theology, my first question would be, whose rites and rituals and whose doctrine and theology? Because there is a diversity of understanding. And I'll give you an example. First of all, we have a diversity of interpretations and practices within our larger Ismaili community. So you've got, right? The other thing that I think is missing in this is, you know, when I think about where I learned it, I may have learned, like, you know, certain hand positions and things. But when I think about the stories and traditions, I also think about my family, right? And I think about the ways in which they have taught me to think about certain practices or ideas, right? And that when I think about, you know, these conversations that I have with my aunts and uncles over chai at night about the ways in which they practice their faith, or how certain concepts and philosophies in faith, or even certain practices that we have in our family, and the meaning that they have behind it, right? Whether they remember this particular, you know, act that they did because it was during wartime and it brought them peace and comfort, is something that I can bring into my own practice and make meaning with. And I think that when we talk about these practices in an RE space, it becomes almost like fossilized, or it becomes like, no, this is the interpretation above all else. But I would say, what about my family's tradition? If my RE teacher is telling me one thing, they have a certain authority, right, in the classroom. That's why they're teaching, or whether, you know, whoever it is. And if they say, well, this is the way to do it, then I said, well, what about the way that I was raised to believe about, you know, certain actions and behaviors and associations with my faith? So I think it's one thing to remember that our families being a really rich families, community. So it's not just my family, but, you know, the people around me, how others practice. There's a rich engagement and conversation in that, right? But also that there's individual meaning making that sometimes gets erased when we say, no, this is the way, right? And there is no right way and there's no wrong way to practice. And I think that that's really important to remember, that even in my family and our immediate family of four, we practice differently. I sit for prayers differently than my family, and they always make fun of me about it and laugh about it, right? But it's how I engage with my faith. And I think that it's really important. And the last thing I'll say about that is that when we preference or we speak about one understanding, even if we say that this is not the only way, when we preference that, we risk erasing the other meanings, right? And the other associations that we have, that other people might have. And there's a harm in that. There's a harm in erasing the diversity, not just of different cultures and civilizations, right, that practices rites and rituals, but of our individual family stories and histories and ways of connecting. Like, you know, I think we forget sometimes in this question and this desperation to have a certain answer, that the back and forth engagement of this and my own journey of making meaning is what makes this rite and ritual so special to me. And I think that's really important. We have this conversation a lot, but I will have it again and again, because I think that it really matters to include a diversity of interpretations, and to be very cognizant of when we don't do that, we erase our own histories, our family histories, and our cultural histories.
I think that was really beautiful, Zahra. And if I may just highlight one more time, couple of points you raised, which I think are so critical. I think first is, when we think about diversity within the Jamaat, we think about Iran and Afghanistan and Syria and Tajikistan. But I think what you're highlighting is that there is a lot of diversity within the USA Jamaat, and within each family has their own tradition and their own practices that they might have, or their own ways of celebrating certain festivals and occasions. And I think there is a lot of beauty and value in ensuring that those traditions, those values do get engaged with at the home level and at the community level. And I think, there is, couldn't be more true, the phrase that it takes a village to raise a child, and I think in our case, when it comes to religious education, it's definitely going to take the entire community to come together to raise the child, because I often joke, I'm sure someone's going to fact check my math, but there's like 8,700 something 40 hours, right? In an entire year, if you count up all the hours. And a child is in the classroom for 80 hours or so. And that's if they attend every single class, right? So they're pretty much in the classroom for less than 1% of their time, right? In any given year. And within that 1% of time, yes, of course, teachers want to talk about theology and doctrine and rites and rituals and even other aspects of our faith and tradition within the broader civilizational approach. But as you can imagine, there's only so much a teacher can offer within 80 hours of time. And I think it becomes that much more important that as a community, we come together to ensure that the religious education, that formation is not solely made the responsibility of the RE teacher. We have to get our minds away from this drive-by RE, as a concept. Like it has to continue and has to happen outside of the classroom and outside of Jamaat Khana space as well.
So speaking of that, you said it takes a community, it takes a village, and that some of this work has to be done outside of RE. So if our parents and community members need support with understanding these concepts or digging into these concepts, where can they go to strengthen their knowledge and engagement with these ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are quite a few opportunities. I am sure with our listeners, I am probably preaching to the choir, I imagine, but we have critical conversations, we have young adult conversations, we have programs and camps like Al-Ummah, college program on Islam. We have Izines, right, that come to different Jamaats, and those could become opportunities for the Jamaat to catch up with the Izine and ask questions. We're looking at a Call a Izine program, ask a question, right? Those types of things. You could reach out to the teacher educators and the step teachers within your local Jamaats, And so I think there are programmatic opportunities that are systematically there. I think we could definitely do more to make this type of dialogue and engagement and interaction more accessible. But I also want to highlight the individual agency around understanding and reflecting on some of these concepts, dissemination of personal and familial beliefs and practices to the children, because offering systematic, sustained programs is one part, but the individual has to take ownership and agency as part of the bayah that we do to the Imam. As part of the bayah that we offer on behalf of our children, I think each family has the accountability to ensure that this work is taking place outside of these formal spaces as well.
With respect, I'm going to push back just a little bit. I agree with everything that you're saying, but what you talked about, this idea of individual agency, which again, I agree with, but what would you say to the notion that individual agency is made difficult by different familial constructs, right? So not every family is two parents. Not every family has family members that are able to go to Jamaat Khana. Not every family has parents that are connected to the faith or have access to it. Maybe they're working all day and just can't make it. Maybe they have some trauma or triggers around faith, around Jamaat Khana. Maybe they're ashamed. Right? How would it feel to be an individual who, is 40 years old, has 2 children, and doesn't have that spiritual connection to rites and rituals, let alone the ability to pass it down to your children, maybe the language for it, that connection to it. So how would you answer that? How would you talk about, that shame or judgment that may come from, other individuals when an adult is struggling with rites and rituals for whatever reason?
Sadiya, I gotta say, I really love that you call this out, because I think this is another example of championing the voices that often don't get heard, and that are really valid in our community. And I think that what you bring up about one, alternative families, or just like the inability sometimes to be the model Jamati member who goes all the time and knows the dua with perfect enunciation, right? Like, I mean, I think that's fair. And I think that your approach about shame, I think is equal, very fair. And I think that, it's humbling to hear that. And I think the reality is, like, we should work to be a more welcoming Jamaat, like, I think you're right. Like, I think that it is really difficult, but the reality is, I'll tell you, as somebody who's been working in RE for a long time, is that it's not just our kids that have questions, it's all of us at different times. This is what it means to engage with faith. That even if you think you know all of everything, you're going to come across a situation that leaves you dumbfounded, where you have questions, where you question your own faith journey, right? And I think that it is so important to be empathetic to that, and to be aware of the fact that any one of us nobody knows everything, right? And that it's fair game to have a question about rites and rituals and spirituality. It's fair game to have moments in your life, or have most of your life be one that you don't have that connection. And I think that that's a reality of our Jamati members, and I think that's okay. And Anil talks about individual agency around understanding rites and rituals, and I would extend that to say maybe individual agency in extending empathy. Extending empathy and fairness, and the space to be able to allow people to ask those questions, and to allow ourselves permission to ask those questions, right? Because I think when we shame others, we're probably shaming ourselves too, right? Like, how could I not know this? And I think that approach doesn't help anybody. I think the beauty of our faith, and what the imam allows for and encourages, is spiritual search. And what are you searching for if you don't have questions? Right? What does that even mean then? So I think that, I really appreciate that. And I really hope that those of us that are listening, or that have other conversations with other people, that we all remember, myself included, right, to be more empathetic towards and open to the fact that, not everybody is going to have it all together all the time. And that, I would hope that when I hear somebody who is coming to me with this, that I can then help champion their voices and speak to whoever I need to, whether it's Anil directly, right? Or my, my local leaders, to say, hey, this seems to be a need in our Jamaat, and how can we fulfill it? That's my take anyway. I think you're right.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for your thoughts, and for your time and your brilliance. I know I've walked away with a greater appreciation for the depth and intricacy of our curriculum, of how it's built to set our students up for success in the world, and impart them with a deep understanding and appreciation for their Muslim identity from a holistic perspective. And I thoroughly enjoyed myself with the two of you. So thank you for all of that radiance. So with everything that's been shared, we've received a few questions from our audience. We're bumping up against the end of our session, so we may keep it to 1 or 2 questions. And I'm sure we would all love to hear your insights on these questions, and we'd all benefit from it. So with that, let's turn to our first question. So someone asked, would you have resources that you can recommend for us to better understand the civilizational approach?
I'm going to take this one before Anil does, in case he steals my answer.
Go ahead.
My favorite resource, I'm almost positive this is going to be Anil's answer. My favorite resource is actually the STEP curriculum, and specifically Muslim Civilizations, MSc, Muslim Societies and Civilizations, Volume 1 and 2. A lot of the STEP curriculum covers civilizational approach, but that's the first one. And it's super accessible, and it touches on all of the things that Anil and I have spoken about, whether it's art, architecture, landscape, geography, climate, language, and it looks at pre-Islamic civilization and then ushers us into Islam. So I think that that's a very accessible tool for the Jamaat. And even though it's a curriculum book for kids, it's actually, I know that I have grown in my own understanding of my faith through these modules. So I would highly encourage any Jamati member to pick them up.
So Anil, was that your response, or do you have something else for us?
I 100% concur with Zahra. I would also perhaps just add for those who are interested in learning more and thinking more about this deeply, to perhaps just reflect on their time if they were born. I understand now we have a lot of US born and raised Jamaat, but if those of you who have connections to other parts of the world, particularly parts of the world where there is a national Islamiyat type of curriculum, pick up some of those texts and pick up some of our curriculum and kind of take a look at them side by side, and you'll kind of begin to very quickly parse out the types of approaches and the types of differences that you will see in those types of curriculums in many parts of the world versus the kinds of approaches you will see within our curriculum. And I think that is probably the easiest way to kind of understand how that type of approach to civilization, humanistic, normative even, right? And it's not, I want to add, it's not simply just civilizational at the cost and absence of normative beliefs and values and practices, right, that we're looking at. But I think that type of comparative analysis might be really interesting for those who are interested in looking at this a little bit further. But I think it really comes down to kind of making meaning of it through the kinds of work Maulana Hazim is doing recently, I think, and reflecting on how that is perhaps different than what other faith leaders might be doing within the Ummah and even beyond the Ummah. We reference some of the type of work Hazim is doing and the investments he's making in different types of spaces. I think it's all part and parcel for me in how we engage with the world and how we represent our faith civilizationally, so to speak.
Thank you. Farhana has also put some information in the chat about resources. So we're going to move on to our second question. Is there a risk that the civilizational approach could be misconstrued depending on how it's taught or who's teaching it, as being willfully disconnected from the faith that gives life to it in the first place?
I think that's a really, really great question. And I want to commend whoever is asking that question, because if done thoughtlessly or carelessly, there is a very fine line between a religious education program, a religious education curriculum, and a religious studies learning, or even I would say social studies learning. And I want to ensure that our listeners don't walk away thinking that because we're talking about a civilizational approach to RE, now we're talking about a social studies type of curriculum. That is not the intent, and that should not be what I hope anybody takes away from this. But it's really about helping students, as we were saying earlier, make meaning of it, nuance it, ground themselves, situated, and really kind of look at sources of inspiration to kind of reflect on what meaning they draw. Ultimately, you can't force a believer out of a child. You can only invite them. You can only bring the right sources of inspiration, and ultimately the passion, the excitement, the motivation of the teacher is really what's going to allow the child that freedom to explore and to learn. And to that point, slightly tangential, but I would also encourage our listeners to also be mindful that everyone goes through a journey of faith formation, and to not force particular ideas as end all and be all, right? When it comes to that. And so I think the question is a valid one. It's an important one, but as we look at the curriculum, whether it's primary curriculum, whether it's secondary curriculum materials that we have, you will see that it's grounded civilizationally, but our personal biases are very much clear. Ultimately, it is a curriculum by the Ismailis for the Ismailis, right? And that piece should not get lost, in thinking through all of the other aspects of how we make meaning of this. But Zahra, I don't know if you want to add anything else to this.
Yeah, I had a couple. I mean, I think you put it really well, and I think that there's a couple of things I want to say. One is that, I mean, the question, whoever asked the question, you're right, that's a great question, and the answer is yes, there is a risk. That's the reality, because it does depend on who's teaching it. But that there is a civilizations or like a social studies curriculum, as you said, and then there's civilizations as a means or a vehicle to teach religion. Why are you teaching this, right? So are you teaching this to learn about a geography, Or are you teaching all of these different aspects to learn about the facets of a faith, right, or of a religion? And so I think that it's really important to look at the purpose and how one leads to the other. And that when we're talking about the civilizational approach within the Talim and the STEP and the ALIF curriculum, specifically within these three, within the RE context, it absolutely is an approach that is for the purpose of teaching religion, right? So the curriculum, for example, in STEP is not, just societies and civilizations, it's Muslim societies and civilizations. I think the other thing is that you can't actually teach civilizations without teaching about religion. One is, part of the other. And the last thing I want to say about this is that, Anil alluded to this earlier, but the pedagogy is a part of how is really important to the way in which we teach things. And one of the goals of this curriculum is not just to teach, of RE, sorry, I should say, is not just to teach about the civilization itself or the civilization as a way of looking at religion. It's to teach critical thinking and historical thinking skills. It's to be able to teach students the skills to be able to pick up artifacts, to pick up facts, to pick up understandings and say, how do I understand this? Who wrote this? Is this person, how do I understand this information in that time period? And how do I apply those skills today? And I think that the civilizational approach is one of that facilitates that critical thinking and that critical engagement that provides students the tools to be able to then see how it fits in for them. And that's a really key part of the learning that we only slightly touched upon, right? But it's the skills. This is a skills-based RE, and the skills that they learn, right? To be able to discern information, to be able to be, to be able to use their own intellect to determine, is this something of value or helpful or useful, right? Or how does this piece fit into all the rest of the things that I'm learning, as opposed to just taking it at face value and saying, okay, this is what it is and I'm done. In my classroom, I always tell my students, if you're not asking me questions, that means you're not actually doing what if you want, we give progress reports, right? And they always want outstanding. And I'm like, outstanding means that you are asking me questions. I want you to make me sweat up there because I know this information. It's not going to help me to say it again and again, right? I want you to take this information and instead of saying, okay, that's it, I want you to push back and say, but Ms. Zahra, how come this, right? So I think it's taking that criticality, and that's what helps with civilizational approaches. It allows for the development of those critical thinking skills.
Wonderful. I know we are bucking up right against time, but we have another question and it is so good. Do I have your permission to keep you just a few minutes longer?
Yeah, I'm okay to stay, Sadiya.
Great, thank you. So the question was, the individual wrote, thanks for sharing your thoughts regarding the diversity of practices. I'm personally very concerned about the erasure of knowledge about the Khoja heritage civilization. Hardly any research is conducted on this tradition, which has shaped the faith and spirituality of a large proportion of the global Jamaat. We know so much more about the Fatimids than our immediate antecedents. How does the civilizational approach help us to learn and preserve these traditions?
I know waiting for me to go first. I will take a stab at this. So I'm not actually sure that I agree with this question. So first of all, I think that it's, what I do agree with is the preservation of any heritage and civilization, right? That's so important. We never want to lose that. Even if we don't currently practice it in the same way, it's so important to have that history. But I don't actually think that there's a dearth of research on this tradition. There can always be more, but you have some really critical players in the religious studies game that are focusing on the Khoja tradition, specifically looking at Ginaz. You've got Dr. Ali Asani, you've got Aziz Ismail, and those are just the two that I can name off the top of my head. But there's actually a pretty rich tradition. I think Harvard has a specific sort of course or area of study on this as well. The other thing that I would disagree with is that that this is representative of a large proportion of the global Jamaat. It's actually not. So I do think it's important to keep that in context. It's hard to forget that when we're in the US because we're mostly surrounded by our Khoja peers, but that's just exclusive to here. So I would say to this listener that I wouldn't worry so much that these things are being done, but also that I would encourage that, I know that there are people going back at all ages to go and offer their talents and resources, going back to school to help with translation movements for some of these documents. And hopefully, what we can encourage in our students, especially in your family tradition, is if this is important to you, then maybe there are people around us that can carry that on and continue that tradition of research that's already being done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Anil, anything to share?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really wonderful question, Sadiya, and it's an interesting one for me to kind of think about. I feel, but this is a personal view, that research on living traditions, I think, is always more challenging than looking at the past, because examining lived tradition that exists poses particular tensions that exist between this idea of preservation that Zahra talked about, and this idea of evolution and change as a tension. And so in my humble opinion, I don't know if this should be a reason enough to not research either the South Asian tradition or any of our traditions within the Jamaat. But I think potentially, I can't speak on behalf of anyone else, this is simply my views, but I think potentially part of the reason may be that it's easier to research texts that existed, 1,000 years ago than it is to research a lived community and their experience. I think Indic traditions have such a rich history of cultural encounters and of sharing and of spiritual search and meaning making, and even how some of the differences between different communities and the lines and how they were often blurred, and there's a borrowing and very open sharing of these traditions, I think is really beautiful to kind of even learn from how cultures evolve. And I think since we're talking about civilizational approach, I think there's a lot of lessons perhaps we could learn from, even from that perspective. Zahra, you referenced this idea of Imam kind of talking about Ginans being a wonderful tradition. I think there's a lot of beauty within that, right? But I think there's also a tension where, if I may share, I think there is a certain risk within our community of taking perhaps certain allegories or metaphors from the Ginans and other texts of the Indic traditions, and turning them into historical facts, perhaps, or turning them into ideas about a particular perceived future that is being foretold, in the past. And I think we have to navigate through some of those tensions as that research takes place. I don't think it's reason enough to not do the research. I think perhaps this is simply, again, my view, instead of academic scholarly research of the text and trying to kind of draw very clear conclusions, perhaps a more meaningful approach, in my view, would be to encourage dialogue and sharing and reflection within our traditions. Like, how wonderful would it be if a call like this was there, and then people kind of came on from different countries around the world, or even different heritages, even though they might be all from North America or the US, and sharing the stories of their forefathers, that they may have been passed down, certain beliefs, certain practices, certain traditions and ways of doing things, how festivals may have been celebrated in different parts and in different times, and I think that type of sharing perhaps might hold, I imagine, more value than academic research text, although that is somebody else's job, and so I can't speak for their behalf. But I think the question is a valid one. I think one solution may be to generate more dialogue and sharing as a way to honor these traditions, whether it's the Indic traditions or other traditions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for staying just a little bit later. Thank both of you for a wonderful conversation, and thank you, audience, for joining us today for this webinar, and also for staying late. I appreciate you. A few announcements before you go. For the recording of this conversation and past conversations, please visit the Facets of Faith page on the Ismaili. The link is available in the chat box right now. Also, last but not least, please take the survey at the end of the session that'll pop up on your screen as you leave. Thank you all again so much, and Yali Madat, everyone.
Thank you, Yali Madat, everyone.
Yali Madat, thank you.